In October of 1628, the proud flagship Batavia left the Netherlands with more than 300 passengers and crew, carrying treasure chests of silver and jewels meant to buy spices in the East Indies. But within a year, only a fraction of those souls would still be alive, because on a barren chain of islands off Australia, a nightmare of mutiny, mass murder, and desperate survival unfolded that remains one of the darkest true stories of the sea. What happens when a shipwreck turns into a battlefield between innocent castaways and a ruthless band of killers, led by a man who believed he was destined to rule a new kingdom of blood? Stay with me, because this is the horrifying true story of the Batavia Mutiny, and it will take you through storms, betrayal, and one of the most shocking massacres in maritime history. The year was 1628, and the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was the most powerful trading empire on Earth, sending fleets across oceans to seize control of the spice trade. Among these ships was the brand new Batavia, a 150-foot-long merchant vessel armed with 24 cannons, packed with gold and jewels in its hold, and carrying not only sailors and soldiers, but also families and wealthy passengers bound for Batavia, today's Jakarta, where fortunes waited to be made. At the top of the chain of command stood Francisco Pelsaert, the fleet commander, but his position was complicated by the fact that the Batavia also had a ship's captain, Arjen Jacobs, a man with whom he already had bitter history. 2 years earlier, Jacobs had insulted Pelsaert publicly in a drunken tirade, and now fate had forced them together again, sharing power on a long, dangerous voyage. But what Pelsaert didn't know was that Jacobs was plotting something much darker. Because on board the Batavia was also Geronimus Cornelis, a VOC merchant with disturbing beliefs who dreamed of building a utopian colony where he would rule like a god, and together, Jacobs and Cornelis began to recruit mutineers, planning to seize the Batavia, murder the officers, and take its treasure for themselves. Imagine being trapped on a ship in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by men smiling at you by day, but secretly plotting your death by night. The Batavia's voyage was cursed almost from the start. Storms in the North Sea scattered the fleet, leaving the Batavia isolated, and as it pushed into the Indian Ocean, Jacobs deliberately steered off course, hoping to weaken Pelsaert's authority. But instead of buying time for their mutiny, disaster struck. On the night of June 4th, 1629, the Batavia smashed into a hidden reef, the Morning Reef, off the Houtman Abrolhos Islands of Western Australia. The hull cracked open, seawater poured in, and dozens of passengers were hurled into the dark waves, never to be seen again. When dawn broke, survivors clung to debris or swam for their lives, while longboats ferried men, women, and children to a tiny sandy islet now called Beacon Island. About 180 people made it ashore, but their situation was dire. The island was barren, with no fresh water and almost no food, and hundreds more remained trapped on the dying Batavia. As more of the ship broke apart and sank, the survivors salvaged only a few barrels of biscuits and water, hardly enough to feed so many. In this moment of desperation, Pelsaert made a fateful decision. He took a longboat with Jacobs and about 48 men and sailed away, supposedly to search for supplies on the Australian mainland, but when that failed, he turned north toward Batavia itself, more than 1,800 miles away, leaving the castaways behind. Think about it. Stranded on a desert island, your commander gone, your ship destroyed, and whispers spreading that maybe, just maybe, you've been abandoned to die. With Pelsaert gone, authority on Beacon Island collapsed. Into that vacuum stepped Geronimus Cornelis, who declared himself leader and began to reveal the true depths of his ambition. He ordered all weapons, boats, and food to be surrendered into his control. At first he spoke softly, promising order and survival, but soon his rule descended into terror. Cornelis believed the group had to be reduced because there was not enough food and water for everyone. So he began sending groups of men, women, and children to neighboring islands under the pretense of searching for supplies, never intending to bring them back. Some were abandoned to starve, others were murdered outright. On Beacon Island itself, Cornelis and his band of mutineers carried out a campaign of brutality. The sick and weak were executed, families slaughtered, women taken as property, and at night, his men crept into tents to cut throats while others slept. Imagine lying awake on a tiny sand spit in the Indian Ocean, listening to footsteps outside your shelter, knowing that if the mutineers chose you next, you and your family would vanish by morning. Mass graves filled with entire families, including children, soon marked the sand of Beacon Island, and by some estimates, Cornelis was responsible for more than 100 deaths. But not everyone submitted to Cornelis. A group of soldiers led by Wiebbe Hayes had been sent to West Wallaby Island, about 5 miles away, supposedly to search for water. To Cornelis, it was a convenient way to get rid of them. Yet against the odds, Hayes and his men discovered a freshwater spring, along with small animals and birds they could hunt. Unaware of the massacres on Beacon Island, they built crude shelters and even a small stone fort, arming themselves with makeshift weapons from wreckage and coral. When survivors from Seal Island escaped to them on rafts and told them of the horrors Cornelis was committing, Hayes realized the mutineers would come for them next. So the soldiers prepared for battle, turning their little island into the first European fortress in Australia. Sure enough, Cornelis launched attacks, first with boats of armed men, then later with muskets salvaged from the Batavia, but Hayes's group fought them off again and again, capturing Cornelis himself during one skirmish and executing some of his lieutenants. For the first time, the mutineers' reign of terror met resistance, and Hayes became the unlikely hero of the Batavia tragedy. Think about it. Armed with nothing but stones, sticks, and improvised weapons, a handful of desperate soldiers managed to hold out against murderers armed with steel and guns because their only other choice was certain death. Meanwhile, after 33 days at sea, Pelsaert and his men in the longboat achieved the impossible. They reached Batavia itself, battered but alive, and Pelsaert quickly secured a rescue ship, the Sardam, to sail back south. But by the time he returned, 3 months had passed and the islands had become killing fields. As Pelsaert approached the Abrolhos, he spotted smoke signals, and to his shock, survivors in a small boat came racing toward him, shouting warnings. The mutineers were still armed and plotting to seize any rescue ship that arrived. Pelsaert ordered his men to prepare muskets, and just in time because another boat of mutineers appeared, trying to reach the Sardam, but instead of seizing it, they found themselves surrounded, overpowered, and forced to surrender. With Cornelis already captured, the mutiny collapsed, and Pelsaert began an on-site investigation. The survivors testified to the killings, the rapes, the betrayals, and the mass graves that dotted Beacon Island. Those judged most guilty, including Cornelis, were executed on the spot. In grisly fashion, their hands were cut off before they were hanged, their bodies left as warnings. Others received floggings or were marooned on the Australian mainland, becoming, strangely enough, the very first Europeans to live there. The worst punishments were saved for men like Wouterloos, Cornelis' successor, who was later executed in Batavia on the infamous breaking wheel, a punishment so horrific it shocked even his contemporaries. When the Batavia left the Netherlands in October 1628, it carried more than 320 people. By the time the Sardam returned survivors to Batavia, only 122 remained alive. Geronimus Cornelis alone was responsible for over 100 murders, making him one of history's most prolific killers, though he never confessed and died defiant on the gallows. Wiebbe Hayes, by contrast, was celebrated as a hero, promoted in rank, and remembered for saving dozens of lives with courage, ingenuity, and sheer determination. Today, the island where he and his men built their fort is known as Wiebbe Hayes Island, and the ruins of their stone walls remain, the oldest known European structure on Australian soil. As for Francisco Pelsaert, though he had made the heroic voyage to Batavia and returned with rescue, his superiors judged him harshly for failing to control the ship and prevent the mutiny. His reputation ruined, his assets seized, Pelsaert died within a year of the Batavia disaster, his name tarnished despite his efforts. In the end, the Batavia became more than a shipwreck story. It became a brutal lesson about what happens when human greed, fanaticism, and cruelty are unleashed in isolation, where law and order vanish, and only the strongest, or the most ruthless, survive. The wreck of the Batavia lay hidden beneath the waves for more than 3 centuries, until it was rediscovered in 1963, and today its remains can be seen in the Western Australia Museum. But perhaps the most haunting relic is not the wood or the cannons. It's the story of what happened to the people stranded on those tiny sand islands in 1629. A story of treasure and betrayal, of innocent families slaughtered, of soldiers building a fortress out of coral to hold back evil, and of a tyrant who believed he could carve a kingdom from blood and terror. The Batavia reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying danger is not the storm or the reef or the hunger, but what people are willing to do to each other when they believe no one is coming to save them. So the next time you hear about a shipwreck, remember the Batavia and ask yourself, in a world without rules, who would you become? The victim, the mutineer, or the fighter who builds a fortress out of stone?